The air in the subterranean confinement block tasted like wet rust and forgotten dreams. General Marcus sat rigid on the cot, his spine aching with the memory of better posture. For 3 standard cycles, his world had been defined by the measured drip of condensation in the corner and the distant muffled screams of those less important than he. His disgrace was total, a cold, heavy blanket woven from the lives lost at the Battle of the Obsidian Wastes, a defeat that even now played on an endless, silent loop behind his eyes. He had become comfortable in the quiet vacuum of failure. It was a sanctuary from the relentless demand for decisions. Then, the heavy chrome bolt of his cell lock shrieked, slicing through the silence like a scalpel. It was an unauthorized sound, a violation of the deep protocol that governed this tomb for the strategically damned. Marcus didn't move, yet every nerve ending tightened, anticipating pain or, perhaps worse, interrogation. A searing white light spilled into the gloom, momentarily blinding him. Framed against the harsh glow stood the silhouette of power, impossible to ignore. Queen Aethel of the Cobalt Lineage, the last sovereign of a fracturing realm, stepped across the threshold. She was magnificent and terrifying, not merely tall, but imposing, clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered with the distinctive, unnerving blue sheen of her draconic lineage. Her presence was an Arctic front, freezing the moisture in the stale air. She did not bother with guards. She was her own army. She surveyed the cell, the grime, the mold, the man who was once the pinnacle of military genius, with an expression of clinical disdain. General Marcus, I had hoped to never see this cage, or you, again. Her voice was low, resonant, carrying the subtle, crystalline echo of the mountain caves from which her ancestors hailed. But hope is a luxury my kingdom can no longer afford. Aethel took a slow, deliberate step deeper into the cell. The sound of her pressurized boots on the concrete floor, a harsh counterpoint to the silence. She did not mince words, launching immediately into the functional reality that had driven her here. The Gorgons are at the outer stratospheres. Their psionic weaponry has rendered 3 of our orbital defense stations inert. Their terrestrial advance is anchored by that cursed, shifting miasma, a magical plague that eats metal and minds alike. She paused, her eyes locking onto Marcus's, boring through his exhaustion. You lost the Wastes, Marcus, but you lost it to a human tactical error, not to the abyssal magic we now face. Marcus finally shifted, the meager blanket falling away. Your Majesty, I believe the appropriate response to my tactical error has already been executed. Or are these accommodations merely a long preamble to the firing squad? His voice was gravelly, unused. Aethel ignored the sarcasm. The offer, the incident that would redefine his fate, hung thick between them. The Gorgons demand a genius equal to their horror. Their miasma is a strategic puzzle, Marcus, and you are the only one left capable of solving the unsolvable. I require your mind. She inhaled, the gesture tiny but significant. And I require a unified front to quell the hysteria in the Senate. I offer you full pardon, the rank of War Master Regent, and my hand in marriage. You will lead my forces, reverse this impossible war, and stand as consort at my side. The absurdity of the proposal hammered at the walls of Marcus's carefully constructed apathy. Marriage to the Dragon Queen? The reward for his deepest failure was ultimate power and an alliance that screamed political desperation. His first, purely instinctive thought was rejection. The idea of being shackled again, not by chains but by duty, and a woman whose gaze could melt granite, was sickening. He had craved peace. This was a hurricane. Yet as the Queen spoke of the shifting miasma and the geometry of the Gorgon advance, a small, dark ember reignited deep within his strategic mind. It was the thrill of the puzzle, the cruel beauty of an impossible equation. He had resigned himself to oblivion, but oblivion offered no challenge. "And if I fail?" Marcus asked, his voice now steadier, the tactical wheels beginning their grinding turn despite his will. Aethel gave a cold smile, devoid of humor. "Failure is death, Marcus. A far faster, more satisfying death than this slow rot. But understand this. Your refusal now is draga o also dragao failure. I did not come down to the black levels to bargain. You will either take the command, or you will be executed tonight. Not for the Obsidian Wastes, but for treason in the face of annihilation. Choose your path to glory, or choose the darkness. But you choose now, General. The Gorgons do not observe truce times." The Queen's demand was absolute. She gave him no quarter to meditate, no time to grieve the loss of his preferred non-existence. The choice was not between life and death, but between immediate death and a terrible, violent, and glorious potential death, achieved while solving the most complex strategic problem ever conceived: the weight of the kingdom, the icy expectation in Aethel's cobalt eyes, and the sudden vivid mental image of the miasma's swirling patterns, all pressed down on him. The choice was made less by his will and more by the innate, unavoidable function of his brilliant, cursed mind. "Give me the operational data," Marcus said, the words barely a whisper, but firm enough to carry the weight of irreversible commitment. "I want everything you have on the miasma's phase shifts and the Gorgon supply lines." Aethel's face did not soften, but a flicker of grim triumph crossed her expression. The contract was signed, not with a quill, but with the surrender of his future. She reached to her side, pulling free a hardened data slate, its interface glowing ominously. "The data is yours. The war is yours, General. And my kingdom, if you can still hold it together." She threw the slate onto the cot. It landed with a heavy dragothudragao, shattering the last fragments of Marcus's prison silence and replacing them with the roar of impending battle. The air was already thickening with the stench of ozone and the invisible pressure of consequence. He was free and utterly trapped. The harsh light of the cell's single luminescent bar felt suddenly insufficient, unable to contain the Queen's presence or the overwhelming pressure of the data slate resting on the filthy cot. Marcus did not reach for it immediately. He looked past the metal rectangle to the Queen, recognizing the final, terrifying curve of the transaction. The generalship was his, the kingdom a potential prize, but the price was ownership. "You speak of marriage, Your Majesty," Marcus stated, his voice regaining its professional dryness, the tone he used when stripping a failed strategy down to its suicidal core. "Let us be clear on the terms of that specific operational contract. If I win, I gain the crown and the title, but not your affection and certainly not your trust. If I win, I am your asset, not your husband. If I lose, I am dead. What, precisely, is your role in this equation, Aethel?" The Queen tilted her head, her cobalt hair catching the harsh institutional light. A grimace that might have been mistaken for amusement crossed her lips. "My role, General, is continuity. If you succeed, the lineage is preserved, the kingdom stabilizes, and the marriage is a political necessity. You will command the armies, but you will not command Dragao me Dragao. You will be my consort, my co-ruler, but your first duty will always be the protection of the Dragonesa line. If you fail, I simply execute you and elevate the next desperate fool. My commitment to this war is absolute, Marcus. Yours is contingent on your life. Do not mistake this transaction for sentiment. It is pure logistics." Her eyes narrowed, the unspoken threat more terrifying than any verbal warning. She was giving him everything, precisely because she still held the ultimate power, the ability to execute him the moment he ceased to be useful. The contract was sealed, a purely functional relationship built on mutual urgent need, cemented by the guillotine of possible failure. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the bitter clarity. There were no illusions of partnership, only a shared trench in the face of annihilation. He pushed himself off the stone bench and reached for the data slate. As his fingers, stiff from weeks of incarceration, wrapped around the cold, textured composite, his mind instantly switched gear. The fog of prison apathy evaporated, replaced by the white-hot clarity of the strategist. He was no longer Marcus, the disgraced prisoner, but the functioning calculating machine that had terrified enemies across the 13 sectors. He tapped the interface. The slate hummed, projecting a 3-dimensional holographic overlay that shimmered sickly above the gray blanket. It was a topographical projection of the Cobalt Kingdom's western front, currently dominated by a pulsing, violet malignancy, the Gorgon miasma. The functional context, Aethel murmured, stepping closer, her voice now crisp and focused entirely on the crisis. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a point on the hologram, a massive fortified canyon called the Obsidian Gate. The Gorgons breached the secondary firewall 3 hours ago. Our scouts confirmed they used a novel form of etheric tunneling, bypassing the heavy kinetic defenses. They didn't just smash the gate, General. They slipped past it. The air in the cell grew heavy with the realization of the immediate strategic disaster. The Obsidian Gate was the bottleneck, the choke point designed to stabilize the Cobalt front until the winter deep freeze began. Its loss meant the Gorgon advance would cease to be a frontal assault and become a rapid, decentralized cancer. Marcus's eyes scanned the data feed scrolling down the side of the projection. Unit depletion rates, energy expenditure profiles, and most critically, the phase shift analysis of the miasma. The Gorgons were not using standard siege craft. They were utilizing a form of chaotic, reality-bending magic that turned defenses against themselves. The miasma, Marcus muttered, his fingers flying across the interface, zooming in on the dense energy signature. It's not just a defense screen. It's a localized reality anchor, right? Interfering with local physics, disrupting conventional targeting systems, and maximizing the Gorgon's short-range teleportation capabilities. Aethel confirmed his analysis with a curt, single sound. It renders our primary weapon systems useless, General. Our long-range rail cannons are firing blindly, their trajectories being warped by the field. We cannot engage the enemy on our terms. We are forced to fight their fragmented, chaotic war. Marcus ignored the Queen, his focus absolute. His thumb brushed the section detailing logistics. He immediately identified the core, unspoken crisis. The rapid, uncontrolled expenditure of specialized cobalt crystal ammunition, the only resource proven to mildly irritate the miasma. At this burn rate, the kingdom had perhaps 72 hours before the supply chain snapped, rendering their most elite forces impotent. He stared at the map, seeing not mountain ranges or fortress walls, but equations and vulnerabilities. The marriage, the imprisonment, the risk, all faded into background noise. This was a puzzle, a grotesque, kingdom-ending puzzle, and Marcus, finally, had a piece to touch. The first step was not fighting, but Dragao understanding the true nature of the physics they were up against. The functional context was complete. Utter disaster, zero reliable solutions, and a clock ticking down to the absolute extinction of the kingdom's fighting capacity. The silence stretched, thick and hot, with the odor of ozone and despair. Marcus's focus remained locked on the tactical display, the holographic light washing the grim lines of his face in cold blue. He had dissected the kingdom's terminal prognosis, 72 hours until the specialized anti-miasma crystal reserves were depleted, leaving the entire army fighting a physical war against a metaphysical threat with nothing but conventional explosives. He did not look at the Queen, not even when she stepped up beside the console, her heavy cloak shimmering like liquid metal. Her proximity was oppressive, a suffocating mixture of cobalt scales and regal demand. "The functional context is complete, General." Aethel's voice finally sliced the air, low and lethal. "You have absorbed the data. You have seen the equations of our extinction. I did not bring you here to admire the geometry of our defeat. I brought you here to offer a life or take one." Marcus's hand froze inches above the projection of the beleaguered citadel of Vorkos. "The clock is not merely ticking down to the supply shortage, Marcus," she continued, her breathing steady and deep. "It is ticking down to Drago this Drago moment. Give me the plan, the solution that reclaims my kingdom. Give me the strategy that transforms this wreckage into victory. Tell me how you intend to win this war in the next 24 hours, or return to your isolation cell to await the Gorgons. The choice, and the immediate commitment, must be made, Drago now Dragao." Her words were the trigger, the final variable dropped into his complex calculation. The marriage, the humiliation, the sheer impossible magnitude of the task, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming strategic opportunity. The intellectual challenge superseded the emotional dread. For weeks, imprisoned, his mind had languished in the sterile vacuum of defeat. Now, it was roaring back to life. He slowly pulled his hand away from the projection, the cold air rushing into the space where the hologram had warmed his skin. He turned to face Aethel, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were sharp, devoid of feeling, fixed solely on her status as the ultimate source of resources and command authority. "The war is winnable, Your Majesty," Marcus stated, his voice raspy from disuse, yet carrying the cutting certainty of a newly honed blade. "But only under my terms. Your strategy is broken because your command structure is fractured by dogma. You are fighting the war you wish you had, not the one you have." He paused, letting the weight of the critique sink in. A flicker of cold amusement crossed Aethel's face. She respected the audacity. "I accept the command. I accept the burden of your kingdom's survival. And I accept the distasteful condition of your hand in marriage, viewing it only as the necessary consolidation of power to prevent immediate sabotage by your advisors. My only demand is absolute, unquestioned strategic and operational control. If you hesitate once, if any general counters my orders, I will execute them, and then I will resign my command and ensure your defeat is swift and clean." Aethel studied him, her massive form utterly still, a predator assessing prey that had just shown its teeth. Then she gave a single swift nod, a movement that sealed the fate of millions. "The terms are accepted, General. The command is yours," proved the legend. The atmosphere of the planning room shattered. Aethel moved with sudden, decisive speed, sweeping her cloak as she exited the room, Marcus following just behind her. They burst into the nerve center of the citadel, a towering semicircular operations chamber filled with scores of anxious officers and technicians who had been monitoring the analysis from afar. The room fell into immediate terrified silence as the disgraced General Marcus stepped forward, his chains gone, standing beside the Dragon Queen. Aethel did not speak. She simply raised her armored hand, displaying the ceremonial seal of absolute command. Then she laid it flat onto Marcus's palm. The heavy, cold metal was a shocking weight, a sudden, irreversible transfer of power. Marcus stepped immediately to the main console, ignoring the hundreds of stunned eyes. He didn't review the data, he knew it by heart. His first command was delivered instantly, without preamble, hitting the command center like a physical shockwave. "Signal General Tyros at the citadel of Vorkos," Marcus barked, his voice projecting across the vast chamber, laced with an authority that brooked no debate. "Order the complete, immediate tactical evacuation of all personnel and non-essential armor. The citadel is to be abandoned. All forces must be repositioned to grid Delta 9 within the next 18 hours. A collective gasp ran through the room. Vorkos was the linchpin, the fortress protecting the most critical energy relay nexus. Defending Vorkos was the Draga Unli Dragao existing strategic objective. General! A grizzled general named Kale, Aethel's long-standing chief strategist, stepped forward. His face flushed crimson with outrage. Are you mad? Abandoning Vorkos CDs the entire Eastern Front. It is an indefensible, suicidal act of weakness. This was the true crisis, the revelation of the real problem. It wasn't just the Gorgons' superior magic. It was the rigid, predictable doctrine of the kingdom's leadership that Marcus now had to break. General Kyle represented the cancerous inertia that had brought the kingdom to its knees. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes boring into Kyle's. There was no anger, only calculation. Vorkos is a trap, General, Marcus replied, his tone chillingly calm. It is where the Gorgons want us to be, maximizing the miasma's destructive potential against concentrated defenses. The tactical problem is not the miasma itself, but the predictable deployment that maximizes its chaos. We will deny them the target. He pointed a finger directly at the logistics feed still scrolling in the corner, reinforcing the brutal ticking clock that governed every decision. The 72-hour crystal shortage remains our hard limit, but there is a secondary problem you failed to account for. Kyle. The citadel of Vorkos holds nearly 40% of our reserve cobalt crystal. If the Gorgons seize that inventory in a siege, the 72-hour timer collapses instantly to zero. We don't have 72 hours remaining. We have until the Gorgons launch their inevitable coordinated push against Vorkos, which I estimate to be within the next 48 hours. Marcus's finger stabbed the air again, finalizing the command with terrible clarity. Therefore, the dramatic clock has been reset. We have 18 hours to liquidate the Vorkos position, secure the critical crystal, and redeploy. If we fail this evacuation, the Gorgons gain the resources to sustain the miasma indefinitely, and we lose the war before a single shot is fired in the counteroffensive. 18 hours, Kale. Execute the order, or be executed for treason. General Kale froze, his mouth agape mid-sentence, the crimson hue draining from his face to be replaced by a sickly gray pallor. The implication of Marcus's final statement, Draga, execute the order, or be executed for treason Dragao, was clear, direct, and utterly terrifying. No general in the history of the Cobalt Dragon's service had ever faced such summary judgment for questioning a strategic decision, let alone one issued by a man who, only hours ago, had been awaiting execution himself. The silence that descended upon the high-vaulted operations room was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, synthesized ping of the data streams confirming the Vorkos logistics. Kale swallowed hard, his eyes flickering towards Queen Aethel, searching for the intervention of established hierarchy, for the familiar shield of political immunity. Marcus did not wait for Aethel to speak. He stepped closer to Kale, eliminating the space between them, his presence an oppressive force field. Do not look at the Queen for sanctuary, General, Marcus said, his voice a low, perfect pitch that nevertheless commanded the entire chamber. The Queen purchased a strategist, not a debating partner. My authority is absolute for the duration of this contract. I require two things from you immediately: your unreserved, personal commitment to this timeline, and the transfer of all command keys for Vorkos sector assets to Commander Salas, effective immediately. Do you concede to the order? Kyle bristled, the ingrained pride of a lifelong warrior struggling against the imminent threat to his life. You demand command keys? You intend to strip me of rank on the basis of an 18-hour deadline that is suicidal? Insane? Perhaps, Marcus cut in, perfectly calm. He turned his head slightly towards Aethel, a mere glance. But it is the order. And unless you wish to spend your final minutes learning the intricacies of a dragon-forged execution axe, you will comply. Now. Aethel watched the exchange with an intense, predatory focus. This was the fire she had sought to buy. Marcus wasn't just a mind. He was a surgical instrument of pure will, pruning the dead weight of her existing military structure without hesitation or remorse. The general's compliance was required not just for the plan, but for the validation of her choice. She tilted her head, a faint blue light sparking at the tips of her horns. "General Kale." Her voice resonated with the low, grinding sound of shifting tectonic plates. "You have heard the terms of Marcus's appointment, compliance or consequence. Your choice defines your loyalty to the crown." Defeated, Kale's shoulders slumped. The light in his eyes died, replaced by a bitter, burning hatred directed squarely at Marcus. "I concede," he ground out, pulling the primary access crystal key from his tunic and throwing it onto the operations table. "I will not forget this disgrace, Marcus." "Good," Marcus replied, ignoring the threat. He immediately gestured to the stunned Commander Salis. "Salis, you are now the primary coordinating officer for the Vorkos evacuation. You have 18 hours. Your first priority is not the personnel, but the crystal caches. Secure the Cobalt first, even if it means sacrificing 3/4 of the garrison force in the rearguard action. Are we clear on the priority of resources over lives?" Salis, terrified but energized by the terrifying clarity of the command, snapped a salute. "Clear, General. Resources over lives." Marcus turned back to the holotable, now dominating the space. The moment of political confrontation was over, but the actual work had just begun, and it was already failing. He didn't need the tactical sensors to tell him that his 18-hour window was bleeding out faster than anticipated. The initial frantic attempts to mobilize the Vorkos garrison had already triggered a surge in Gorgon scouting activity. The enemy was highly attuned to defensive changes. "Salis, report on the forward surveillance drones in Sector Gamma 19, Marcus demanded, his fingers flying across the console, accessing detailed topographical maps that showed the rough, miasma-choked plains east of Vorkos. A fresh set of data flashed onto the main display, 3 separate Gorgon patrol vectors converging on the main withdrawal route. These were not major combat units, but elite Dragao-Seeker-Dragao units. Gorgons specialized in stealth, rapid information gathering, and precise, magical sabotage. They were the equivalent of enemy eyes, confirming the garrison's panic. "General, the Seekers are moving faster than projected," Salis reported, sweat beading on his brow as he reviewed the drone telemetry. "They smell the retreat. If they establish forward observation posts on the Crest Ridge overlooking the primary transport canyon, we lose our window to secure the bulk crystal caches through the main route. We'd be forced into the secondary tunnels, slowing the extraction by 6 hours, minimum." The clock ticked violently in Marcus's mind. 6 hours of delay meant the Gorgons would certainly arrive at Vorkos before the crystal could be safely withdrawn. The war would be lost. The Gorgons were reacting to his strategy faster than his own kingdom's bureaucracy. Marcus's jaw tightened. This was the escalation. The Gorgons were proving to be not just magically superior, but tactically adaptive. The risk had just doubled, twisting the evacuation into a near-impossible sprint against a rapidly closing vice. "We accelerate," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of doubt, even as the situation screamed chaos. "We cannot afford a secondary tunnel extraction. We must hold the Crest Ridge long enough for the convoy to pass. Salis, strip the 2nd Heavy Siege Regiment from the eastern wall, the most experienced fighters you have, and dispatch them immediately to Crest Ridge. They are to establish a 20-minute holding action. They will hold the line until the crystal convoy passes, and not a second longer." Kyle, still stewing nearby, hissed, "The siege regiment is Vorkos's spine. You strip the eastern defense for a skirmish on a meaningless ridge, the garrison will collapse." Marcus didn't even look at the disgraced general. His eyes were fixed on the map, envisioning the geometry of sacrifice. "If the crystal is lost, the whole kingdom collapses, General Kyle. 20 minutes of cover is what I require. Tell Commander Gresh of the 2nd Regiment that this is not a retreat, but a stand. He will hold. They will die on that ridge, but the crystal will live. Execute the sacrifice, Salis. The clock is now at 17 hours and 40 minutes and counting. Salis confirmed the order with a chilling, clipped affirmation, the weight of the 2nd Regiment's scheduled annihilation settling like granite dust over the command center. Marcus watched the projection map, tracing the rapid movement of the siege regiments as they diverted, a necessary wound carved into Vorkos's defenses. A flicker of cold, surgical satisfaction passed through him. The sacrifice was underway. The logistics were sound, the timing precise. Then the map seized. It wasn't a technical glitch. The main tactical overlay, which tracked the real-time movement of all friendly and known hostile units across the sector, began to weep. A sickness bloomed across the luminous projection, not static, but an oily, phosphorescent green that bled into the deep cobalt blue of the Dragonese's colors. The movement vectors of the Gorgon advance, usually sharp crimson lines, began to writhe, dissolving into gibberish. The comms officer, a young woman named Liss, who had maintained a nervous stoicism through the preceding crisis, slammed her hand onto her console's hard reset panel. The corruption ignored the command. "Report!" Marcus demanded, his voice suddenly cutting through the calculated calm of the room. He felt the cold shock run from his throat down to his gut. This was not the expected friction of war. Lisa's breath hitched, her eyes wide with visceral terror. "General, the network. It's not jammed. It's corrupted. The primary telemetry array for the Christ Ridge sector just reported catastrophic failure, and the rot is spreading backward toward the main hub. Sir, they aren't using standard electronic countermeasures." Marcus stepped forward, his knuckles brushing the edge of the map table, which now pulsed with the noxious green light. "Define not standard, officer." "It's a weave rot, General," she whispered, fear thinning her voice. "Gorgon magic. It doesn't just interrupt the data flow, it infects the data itself, turning our cipher keys into nonsensical matrices. It's targeting the underlying arcane lattice that holds our communication net together. We can't trust any Dragao incoming or outgoing signal from the forward sectors." The revelation slammed into Marcus with the force of a physical blow. He had accounted for aerial assaults, for ground defenses, for the sheer power of Gorgon sorcery against shields and armor. He had not anticipated a surgical strike aimed solely at the certainty Dragao of his command structure. His entire strategy rested on perfect, instantaneous coordination. The 2nd Regiment had to hold for exactly 20 minutes, and the convoy had to know the exact moment to accelerate past the ridge. If the data was compromised, he might be sacrificing an elite regiment for 20 minutes of meaningless, disconnected violence. The Crystal Convoy, relying on automated routing from the now infected central system, could veer off course, or worse, wait too long, and run directly into the flanking maneuver Marcus had yet to identify without functional telemetry. This was the true, terrifying nature of the war against the Gorgons. It wasn't a war of brute force, but a war of intellectual and magical sabotage designed to induce strategic paranoia and chaos. "How fast is the rot spreading?" Marcus asked, his jaw locked tight. Lice frantically tapped commands into her secondary, shielded console, attempting to isolate the core system before the infection reached the critical mass of Vorkos's central mainframe. "They deployed a localized rupture engine near Sector Alpha 7, General. Our analysts estimate a total network blackout for the entire Western Theater within the hour. But the tactical network, sir, the Christ Ridge sector will be functionally deaf within the next 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The clock had suddenly accelerated, changing its function from a distant deadline for the safety of Vorkos to an immediate, suffocating countdown for the survival of the Crystal Convoy. He had 17 hours until the Gorgons arrived at the city, but only 30 minutes until the sophisticated, interconnected battlefield he commanded dissolved into isolated pockets of fighting men following outdated, corrupted orders. The 2nd Regiment, already in motion toward their designated death site, needed to know the pass-through time. The convoy needed clearance, and Marcus had 30 minutes to ensure the critical communication lines held or devise a mechanism to bypass the entire digital network using methods that were slow, unreliable, and almost certainly exposed. Every second spent trying to scrub the weave rot was a second lost to the coordination of the sacrifice. Marcus stared at the sickly green stain spreading across his operational map, the geometry of war transforming from a chessboard of intellect into a gambling den driven by pure, brutal speed. The dramatic clock was ticking down, not just to the end of the mission, but to the end of his capacity to command it. If he didn't act now, the decision he had made, the blood he had ordered spilled on Christ Ridge, would become utterly irrelevant. The corrosive green spread across the holographic map with predatory efficiency. It wasn't the uniform crawl of a natural disaster, but the rapid, intelligent expansion of a cancer that understood network topology. 17 hours was the distance to Vorkos, but 30 minutes was the maximum lifespan of his tactical control. "Liss, isolate the Christ Ridge channel," Marcus commanded, his voice unnaturally flat, devoid of the usual strategic cadence. "Execute Protocol Phoenix. We're scrubbing the line. Full shutdown and hard reboot. Get the final parameters to Regiment 2 now, before the firewall collapses." Lyce's fingers blurred over the illuminated keys, a desperate rhythmic clicking sound that echoed the frantic beating of Marcus's own pulse. The air in the command center, usually chilled and crisp, felt suddenly thick, suffocating. Every eye was locked on the Western Theater display, watching the digital atrophy consume the arteries of their defenses. "Phoenix initiated, General. Data packages pushing through." "Now," Lyce reported, her voice strained. Her eyes, usually sharp and focused, held a flicker of dread as she watched the progress bar crawl against the tide of the rot. The weave rot didn't just block, it infected. It twisted the signal, injecting malicious code into the very fabric of the data packets. The screen flashed violently, colors bleeding into sickly shades of purple and burnt orange, signifying a violent system rejection. "Report!" Marcus snapped, taking 2 strides toward the console, his hands gripping the edge of the aluminum frame hard enough to bend the metal. "Sir, Protocol Phoenix failed. The virus is intercepting and corrupting the packets Draga or before Dragao. They can be secured by the wipe routine," Lyss cried out, sweat plastering strands of dark hair to her forehead. "The final deployment coordinates for the 2nd Regiment. They're being fragmented. We don't have confirmation. The system is showing partial receipt, but the integrity check is registering 40% corruption." A wave of icy shock hit Marcus, a visceral punch to the gut that momentarily stole his breath. He hadn't just lost communication. He had potentially sent an order that was now nonsensical, or worse, fundamentally wrong. The 2nd Regiment was moving toward a highly precise point on the map, a choke point designed to maximize their sacrificial distraction. If the coordinates were off by even a few degrees, they would be fighting in open terrain, dying uselessly, and failing to draw the necessary Gorgon forces away from the convoy's true path. Dragao, 30 minutes. Dragao, 16 minutes remained now. He swung around, ignoring the desperate pleas of the communications officers attempting to reroute through antiquated satellite relays. They were too slow. They were irrelevant. His entire brilliant plan hinged on surgical precision, and the Gorgons had introduced systemic chaos. "Bypass the network. Activate the runners. Use the old secure lines, physical courier only, and send the revised routing for the supply convoy via Sector 4, Marcus ordered, the urgency finally breaking through his strategic composure. He knew this was an exercise in futility. Physical couriers meant hours of delay, and the convoy was already halfway through the contaminated zone. But he had to try. He watched the display as the tactical indicator for the 2nd Regiment, the flickering green point representing 4,000 doomed souls, ceased updating. The beacon simply froze in place, halfway through the desolate valley of Christridge. It wasn't just a failure to transmit. It was the weave rot severing the connection entirely, rendering the unit functionally deaf and blind to their commanders, locked permanently in the last moment they had digital contact. Marcus slammed his fist onto the console. The heavy, metallic thud was the only sound louder than Lisa's choked gasp. Frustration, hot and paralyzing, washed over him. He was a master of geometry and logistics, a man who saw battlefields as complex equations to be solved. But this was not an equation. It was a plague, an existential force that didn't obey the rules of war. His command staff, the best technical minds in the Cobalto Dominion, were reduced to watching their tools turn against them. "The tactical link is dead, General," Lise whispered, her voice cracking. "Christridge is offline. We cannot confirm the orders were received intact. We can't even confirm they are still following the original vector." His sacrifice had turned into a massacre. 4,000 men were marching into a shadow fight based on potentially corrupted data, isolated in a digital void of the Gorgons' making. His 30 minutes were up, but the clock ticking wasn't about time anymore. It was about control. Marcus had gambled the entire war on the flawless execution of a single maneuver, and the Gorgons had simply removed his ability to maneuver, leaving him stranded, staring at the ghost of his intended masterpiece. The entire Western defense mechanism was now relying on the assumption that the 2nd Regiment would instinctively continue toward their original, unknown destination, even without confirmation. They were ghosts in the machine, and Marcus was the impotent puppeteer whose strings had been cut. The system had failed him, and the price of that failure was already being paid in silent, uncoordinated blood. Marcus felt the paralysis receding, replaced by a terrible clear coldness that started in his chest and spread through his limbs. The fear of failure had vanished. He had failed. That much was certain. 4,000 souls were already lost to the unpredictable darkness of Christridge, their fate sealed by a severed cable and the Gorgons' insidious electronic plague. He pressed his palms flat against the cold metal of the command console, leaning into the display until his breath fogged the glass overlay, where the static symbol of the 2nd Regiment was entombed. He had gambled on a perfect, confirmed maneuver. The Gorgons had countered with pure chaos. He had no time to mourn the dead or regret the strategy. Regret was an indulgence for retired men. Now, he had to accept the corrupted data and the vanished unit as a fixed point, a variable that was no longer variable. The 2nd Regiment was lost, but their Drago Presence Dragao, wherever they were now, was still a physical fact on the battlefield. They were still marching, even if aimlessly, toward a position he had dictated. His eyes flickered to the coordinates of the 3rd Regiment, the Anvil, waiting patiently 10 kilometers south, ready to pin the Gorgon flanking elements once the 2nd had achieved their objective. That objective was now a ghost. The 3rd Regiment was his last piece of control. 5,000 soldiers waiting for a signal that would never be confirmed. Dragao control is illusion. Dragao. A dark, familiar voice whispered in the back of his mind. Dragao leverage is everything. Dragao. Lise, Marcus said, his voice level, stripped of all emotion. It was not a question. It was the tone of a judge delivering a death sentence. What is the 3rd Regiment's estimated time to the Dawn Pass bottleneck, maintaining current speed? Lise swallowed hard, her eyes still glued to the dead tactical link. She knew instinctively what asking about the Dawn Pass meant. The pass was a direct, exposed route. A sacrifice. 27 minutes, General. But, sir, the 2nd Regiment. The 2nd Regiment is moving according to the last set of variables we established, Marcus cut her off, his logic brutal and final. We operate on the assumption that even without instruction, 4,000 men will continue forward momentum until met with opposition. Their tactical link is dead, but their boots are still heavy. Their position is fluid, but their intent is fixed. He straightened, looming over the console. This decision violated every principle of safe command, every calculated risk assessment. He was taking the only fully operational regiment and throwing it directly into the most visible line of fire, purely to force a reaction from the enemy, a reaction he hoped would accidentally guide the lost 2nd Regiment into their intended kill zone. Contact General Var, bypass all secondary objectives. Tell him to commit the 3rd Regiment immediately to a full speed, maximum noise breach of the Dawn Pass. Draw every Gorgon eye on the western flank. They are to make it look like a panicking retreat, a desperate frontal assault. Lyse stared at him, horror dawning in her expression. Sir, that position is uncovered. If they hit the pass now, before the 2nd is in position, Var's entire unit will be pulverized. It's a massacre. Marcus's jaw tightened. It Dragao a massacre, he agreed, the honesty heavy and metallic. But one we can observe. If the 2nd Regiment is moving in silence and shadow, we must create a spectacle of violence to draw the enemy's focus entirely away from them. The 3rd Regiment is now the bait. Var does not attempt to hold the pass. He attempts to loudly Dragao. His commitment was absolute, his voice unwavering. He didn't ask for discussion. He had traded 4,000 phantom soldiers for 5,000 screaming martyrs. The war was no longer about winning with minimal loss. It was about imposing the maximum possible price on the enemy, using his own men as currency. Lys's fingers trembled as they hovered over the comms panel, resisting the transmission of the suicidal order. General, with respect, this is an unacceptable loss ratio. We are giving the Gorgons the tactical initiative. Marcus leaned down until his face was inches from hers, his eyes burning with the cold fire of necessity. We lost the initiative 30 minutes ago when the weave rot cut the connection. Now we buy it back. Execute the order, Lieutenant. Now. The tremor in Lys's hand disappeared. She was a professional, trained to obey the calculus of war, no matter how cruel. She nodded once, a gesture of submission, and the command flashed across the network, prioritized above all other chatter. Dragao Dawn Pass. Immediate commitment. Maximum noise. Dragao. The screen shifted instantly. The 3rd Regiment's icon, previously a cautious, slow-moving block, spiked in velocity and trajectory, turning sharply toward the dangerous exposed bottleneck. The consequence was immediate and brutal. No sooner had the change in vector registered than the Western sensor net, the one Marcus had spent 2 days meticulously tuning, lit up like a supernova. The Gorgons, sensitive to the slightest shift in analog energy or the sheer desperation of a human advance, immediately recognized the exposure of the Dawn Pass. Their previously dispersed defensive formations began contracting, drawing forces away from Crest Ridge and funneling them toward the path of the doomed 3rd Regiment. Lys let out a strangled cry as the 3rd Regiment's movement icon, which had been bright cobalt, began blinking violently red. The Gorgons were not waiting. They were overwhelming the flank immediately, anticipating the easy kill. Confirmed enemy contact, Lys whispered, her face pale. Heavy kinetic fire. Plasma signature. They've diverted the main reserve units from Sector Delta. The sudden, horrifying activity on the western flank was the soundless confirmation Marcus needed. The Gorgons had taken the bait. They saw the chaos and the exposed flank as a gift. They were committing to the destruction of the 3rd Regiment. Marcus watched the visual confirmation of explosions erupting across the Dawn Pass feed, tiny, flickering lights that represented the annihilation of Var's command. It was a terrible, beautiful proof of concept. The Gorgons were reacting to Drago-visible Dragao desperation, precisely because they believed they had crippled Marcus's ability to coordinate the Dragao-invisible Dragao threat. "The 2nd Regiment," Marcus stated, ignoring the screaming data indicators of the 3rd Regiment's imminent demise. He pointed a steady finger back to the frozen icon over Christ Ridge. "They are now free of concentrated enemy focus. The Gorgons believe the decisive action is happening at the pass. The silence means they are marching unmolested." He had accepted the 9,000 casualties as payment. The tactical link was dead, but the battle had shifted from a digital chess match back to analog carnage. The war machine had broken, and Marcus was now fighting in the ruins, using the bodies of his own soldiers to build bridges across the tactical void. He had his leverage. Now, he simply had to wait for the lost regiment to stumble into the trap he had designed, guided by the immense, necessary noise of their comrades' dying screams. The air in the command bunker was thick and metallic, smelling of ozone and despair. Marcus stood absolutely motionless, a statue carved from granite and focused intent, listening only to the high, whining shriek of the system alerts tracking the massacre at Dawn Pass. The 3rd Regiment was dissolving, their tactical icons winking out one by one, replaced by crimson error messages that scrolled too fast for the eye to follow. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Var, fulfilling his sacrificial role, was broadcasting pure, unadulterated tactical panic, drawing every Gorgon reserve unit like a swarm of hungry scavengers. Lyse was hunched over her console, her knuckles white against the metal. A tear carved a clean path through the grime on her cheek, yet she did not wipe it away. She was the one processing the names, the regiments, the final coordinates. "They are gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The last operational squad of the 3rd Regiment. Status: annihilated." The moment the screen at Dawn Pass turned solid, static black, an awful, profound silence descended upon the tactical display. The Gorgons had stopped moving their reserve units. They were consolidating their gains, reveling in the sudden, decisive end to the flank threat. They had secured the emotional victory. Then, 3 seconds later, the Christ Ridge display exploded in a blinding sequence of green icons flashing across the grid. The coordinates had been utterly silent for the preceding 3 hours, a tactical void. Now, the 2nd Regiment, commanded by the stoic General Fadus, had arrived. The attack was not a probing action or a skirmish. It was the catastrophic, total negation of the Gorgons' main supply hub. The tactical map showed the 2nd Regiment's rapid, brutal penetration, a clean dagger through the logistical heart of the enemy. The icons representing fuel depots, munition bunkers, and communications arrays did not blink red or yellow. They simply vanished, replaced by a massive, pulsing thermal signature overlay. Fadus had followed Marcus's primary instruction: make the destruction irreversible. "Thermal confirmation," Lyse shouted, her voice regaining a desperate edge of professional rigor overriding her grief. "Christ Ridge is burning. Estimated 90% destruction of primary Gorgon stores. Communications array shattered. This is not reparable damage, General. They have no strategic reserves left." The silence in Dawn Pass was instantly replaced by a frantic, delayed chaos at the Gorgon command levels. The enemy's secondary icons, the units previously celebrating their victory, suddenly snapped away from the Dawn Pass flank and began sprinting back toward Christ Ridge, realizing the monumental, humiliating trap they had fallen into. They had prioritized the tactical elimination of a visible threat over the long-term protection of their strategic spine. Marcus felt the subtle internal shift that accompanied success. Not joy, but the cessation of unbearable pressure. The cold calculation had paid the required dividend. 9,000 dead souls had purchased the collapse of the Gorgons' advance. He lifted a hand and slowly traced a line across the thermal overlay of Christ Ridge, feeling the simulated heat of the destruction he had ordered. "Lys," Marcus ordered, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Pull the 2nd Regiment back immediately. They have achieved the objective. They are not to engage the retreating Gorgon reserves. Their job is done." He turned away from the shimmering, victory-stained console, letting his gaze fall on the concrete floor. The sudden, nauseating realization of the sheer magnitude of the required sacrifice settled over him. 9,000 lives, including the one tactical link he had maintained, the last vestiges of his old command structure, dissolved into statistics. Lys nodded rigidly, typing the retreat order. She kept her eyes glued to the screen, unwilling to meet the general's gaze. She knew that to look at him would be to see the cost reflected in his eyes, a cost that could never be justified by mere numbers, even those representing the temporary salvation of the kingdom. The tactical map stabilized, showing a massive, gaping hole in the enemy's forward movement. The Gorgon momentum had been broken, replaced by internal panic and the necessity of re-establishing a supply chain that now stretched impossibly thin. The immediate threat to the Dragonesa strongholds was gone. Marcus had delivered the victory Aethel required, but the air in the bunker was cold, heavy with the phantom weight of lost bodies. The metallic scent of ozone now tasted like blood. The system had won, but the humanity in the room was undeniably, utterly defeated. Marcus had paid the price in full, and the debt he owed to his own conscience was now eternal. 3 days later, the air no longer carried the metallic tang of bunker exhaust, but the sharp, sterile scent of ozone and polished obsidian. Marcus stood in the receiving chamber of the Cobalt Citadel, the architecture overwhelming in its display of Dragonesa supremacy. Black marble veined with shimmering electric blue light, reflecting the cold resolve of the rulers. The logistical victory had been absorbed by the collective consciousness of Aethel's court with the impassivity of practiced royalty. They did not celebrate, they merely recorded the shift in power dynamics. Marcus was no longer clad in the frayed, prison-issue tunic. He wore the heavy uniform of a Grand Marshal, though the title felt like a lie clinging to the shoulders of a butcher. The jacket was tailored cobalt blue, the gold braiding stiff and unfamiliar, constricting his breathing. His hands, still smelling faintly of disinfectant and strategic maps, felt alien wrapped around the hilt of a ceremonial sword, an unnecessary accoutrement, now that the fighting had paused. Aethel stood upon the dais, far above him, wrapped in robes that caught the light like frozen scales. She did not smile. She never smiled. She merely regarded him with the same analytical scrutiny she had applied to his prisoner profile months before. "The Gorgon retreat is confirmed," Aethel stated, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics, carrying the weight of ancient stone and absolute authority. "Your deployment of the sacrificial units at Christridge secured the tactical spine. The debt is cancelled. The kingdom holds." Marcus felt the weight of the victory descend upon him. It was a physical thing, a crushing stone placed where his heart used to beat. He had done the impossible. He had proven his worth, not just as a strategist, but as a weapon capable of self-destruction. "The contract stands, General Marcus," she continued, the sound of his rank now sounding less like respect and more like ownership. "You requested the sovereignty and the hand of the monarch. Both are yours." The ceremony was brief, clinical, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was less a wedding and more the signing of a massive infrastructure project. An advisor placed a heavy, wrought iron ring upon Marcus's finger. It was cold, engraved not with symbols of affection, but with the Dragonesa sigil, a stylized, watchful eye. He was not marrying a woman. He was merging with an institution. Later, in the vast echoing rooms that were now officially designated the consort's quarters, Marcus stood overlooking the capital. It was safe now, held in the iron grip of the Cobalt regime. He had bought this peace with 9,000 souls. Ethel entered without announcement, her movements silent despite the heavy fabric of her sleeping silks. She stood several paces behind him, a magnificent, dangerous silhouette against the pale, artificial light filtering from the ceiling. "You look like you are waiting for the next siege, husband," she observed, her tone flat. "I am waiting for the cost, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, not turning around. He pressed his knuckles against the icy pane of glass, feeling the slight tremor of the city's massive power core vibrating beneath the citadel. 9,000 men. The kingdom is preserved, but my reputation is cemented. I am the general who burns his own forces to achieve victory. I am the monster. Ethel stepped closer, and Marcus could feel the faint residual chill radiating from her Dragonese bloodline. She stopped directly behind him, close enough for the delicate, crystalline pins in her hair to catch the faint scent of his guilt. "No, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping, becoming a low, resonant rumble that only he was meant to hear. "You are the cornerstone. They called you fallen. They called you traitor. Now, they call you savior, and they will call me wise for having retrieved the instrument. The people require protection, and protection requires savagery. You delivered the savagery. I provided the sanction." She placed a single cool hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of absolute possessiveness. He felt the weight of her claim, not just on his body or his name, but on his capacity for ruthlessness. "You have your freedom from the cell, and your glory among the stars," Ethel whispered, the thematic echo settling over him like a shroud woven from ice and the memory of fire. But freedom is merely the expanded territory of one's obligations. You are not free, General. You are bound, now and forever, to the protection of the kingdom you saved. You paid the ultimate price, and in return, you received the ultimate burden. Marcus finally turned, looking into her cold, intelligent eyes. He was married to the war, married to the system, married to the burden of command that demanded not just his tactical brilliance, but his complete moral annihilation. He was the king consort, a position of supreme, terrible power. He had chosen glory over death, and in doing so, he had achieved a life far colder, far more final, than any execution. He stood in his gilded cage, the kingdom sprawled out beneath him, a kingdom won by his betrayal and secured by his eternal, unforgiving vigilance. The victory was his, and the prison was infinite.